Hi, I'm Tony Northrup, and today, for my photography buying guide, I'm going to talk about a property of cameras that sometimes we measure but don't really ever talk about, and that's the optimal image quality. And that's the quality that you'll get out of the camera when working at the base ISO. So who uses this? Landscape photographers will usually use their base ISO to get the best possible image quality. Portrait photographers will either shoot in a studio environment where they have all the light they need, or they'll be working outdoors under sunlight or in the shade. And generally they'll be able to shoot at the base ISO. And for portrait photographers, getting nice clean images at that base ISO is really important because any noise will make the skin look bad and you'll always end up going back and smoothing it, and that's a time-consuming process. Studio photographers and commercial photographers like myself, we have to produce perfect images, and no picture comes out of the camera perfect, even at the base ISOs. So before a commercial client will usually accept one of my images, even shot at, say, ISO 100 on a 5D Mark III, I have to go in and manually remove noise from shadow areas, and that's a time-consuming and expensive process. So if I can find a camera that has a better optimal image quality, then that can save me time and money. Finally, if you're a night photographer and you're working on a tripod, even at night you're going to be shooting at the base ISO usually, and you'll want the best possible image quality for making large prints. You probably don't care about optimal image quality if you're shooting moving subjects like sports or wildlife, because you'll have to use a higher ISO than the base ISO anyway. And if you're shooting in low light, taking pictures of your friends at a restaurant, and you're not using flash, then you'll have to use a higher ISO too. So none of this measurements I'm talking about matter at all if you're shooting at anything other than the base ISO. In those cases, you could probably just go to DxOMark and look at their ISO score for a camera and get a pretty good sense for how it's going to perform. The main factors in optimal image quality are the maximum light gathered by the camera, the maximum light the sensor could possibly gather. And there are two factors within that. The sensor size, bigger sensors gather more light at a given ISO because it's like a bigger bucket catching more rain. And the base ISO, lower base ISOs like ISO 100 gathers twice as much light as ISO 200. So the lower the base ISO of the camera, the better. We're talking about a real ISO. Most cameras allow an extended ISO. They'll have a real ISO of 100 and then an extended ISO of 50. But 50 is really just ISO 100, like adjusted down in software. So it doesn't really count. You want the base ISO that the sensor is designed for. The other factor besides the maximum amount of light the sensor can gather is the sensor's efficiency. Just how much of the light that it receives does it actually turn into a useful signal? And we do see variances here between sensors that end up being important. Of course, I'm going to get a bunch of comments about this. Of course, sensor quality, image quality is not everything. It's the photographer that matters most. That's why I wrote a whole book about photographic techniques, stunning digital photography. That's more important than any factor that your camera could possibly produce. Technique matters. Of course, most people put their pictures on Facebook or they make small prints, and image quality just doesn't matter that much. But to some of us, it really does. And for some of us, having cleaner images can save us time and money and let us get out there and shoot more. Of course, it's also interesting if you're a tinkerer like myself. If you're the type who takes things apart just to understand how they work, you'll probably find this discussion interesting. Here is a colorful chart. I spent a lot of time this weekend putting this together. What we have here is the best camera over on the left towards the worst camera over here on the right, based on all cameras made in 2014 and then a variety of other cameras that I think people are particularly interested in. So we basically have the entire Canon and Nikon and Sony, most of the Sony lineup in here, and then a couple of Micro Four Thirds cameras too. We see the very leftmost camera there is the Nikon D810. This happens to be the very best camera in the world for optimal image quality. If you're taking a picture in a studio or landscape photography, it turns out, based on DxOMark's measurements, that this will produce the cleanest image ever. And I'll show you how to check that on DxOMark in just a minute. The second best camera was the A7R. You can see based on this chart that the A7R produces 0.37 more stops of noise in the images at the base ISO than the D810 does. And surprisingly, the A7S, which I have here, even though the A7S is much cleaner at higher ISOs, it's not cleaner at the base ISO. And we'll compare those cameras in a little more detail in a bit. Now, this chart expresses these differences in stops. And a lot of people ask about stops, but I actually don't think that's the most useful way to compare the cameras. because stops are a logarithmic measurement. Each stop doubles the amount of noise from the previous stop. So when we say 3 stops down here, we really mean 8 times more noise. 2 stops difference is only 4 stops more noise. So let's take away the logarithmic and make it a more linear scale. What we have here are times worse than the D810. So at the 2 mark here, it's 2 times worse. As the 3 mark, it's 3 times worse. And at the bottom, it's 8 times worse than the D810. I've color-coded this so that the full-frame cameras are in green. The APS-C 1.5x crop factor cameras, like the Nikon and the Sony APS-C cameras, are orange. The Canon APS-C cameras, which have a smaller sensor, 1.6x crop, they're yellow. And then the Micro Four Thirds cameras, which have about a 2x crop, are in blue. So right away, visually, you can see that sensor size is a big factor in optimal image quality. And there are a couple of reasons for that. But all the full-frame cameras are better than all the APS-C cameras. And almost all the APS-C cameras are better than the Micro Four Thirds cameras. Note that there's one Micro Four Thirds camera that surpasses one APS-C camera. The GH4 has a pretty remarkable sensor for its size and a lower base ISO than the other Micro Four Thirds cameras. And the 1200D is also the Canon T5, and that's a terrible camera. Well, it's a good camera for entry-level photographers, but it has a really outdated sensor in it. So the sensor technology is behind these other cameras. There's some interesting comparisons here. Now, the D810 and the D800, the D800 has about 1.35 times more noise than the D810, even though the sensor technology is very similar. What Nikon did was they introduced a lower base ISO. They went from a base ISO of 100 on the D800 to a base ISO of 64 on the D810, allowing it to gather 2/3 more light. And we can see that largely improved the amount of noise that would be visible in pictures taken at that base ISO. We can also see that the 5D Mark III, the Canon, didn't do that bad, producing basically 55% more noise than the D810. It's reputed that the Nikon sensors are just vastly superior to the Canon sensors, but even the difference between a D800, the original, and the 5D Mark III isn't that bad. Another surprising point here is that the D810 beat the Nikon D4S by a substantial margin. In fact, if you're shooting in a studio, the best you can do with the D4S is going to have about twice as much noise as with a D810. The D4S is like a $6,500 camera and the D810 is about $3,300. Both expensive cameras, but the D4S is what people often choose by default when they're doing serious commercial work. And most of those people are going to be better off shooting with a D810. It also has more megapixels, so it will produce sharper and more detailed images than the D4S. It's also interesting that the Canon 5D Mark III beat the big boy of the Canon lineup, the 1DX. So as you can see, these high-end pro cameras don't necessarily produce cleaner images in the studio or in landscape photography when you have plenty of light and you're able to use that base ISO. In the Nikon lineup, I was surprised to see that the D3300, the little camera over there in the red, is actually the best studio camera. Now, it might not have the features you want. For example, it doesn't do bracketing, so if you want to do landscape photography, that could end up being a problem, but it's definitely going to produce the cleanest images when working at the base ISO, and by a noticeable difference. You'll actually see cleaner images coming from a D3300 than you would a D5300 or even a D7100, which is worse than even the D5300. Here's the full-frame winner, the D810 at its base ISO against the APS-C winner, the D3300 at its base ISO. We see more color in here, even though it should be completely black. That's noise, and more graininess. Both these images have been scaled to the same resolution. Canon, as we see on the right here, like I said, they have smaller sensors, and so they simply can't keep up with the larger sensor APS-C cameras. And Canon technology is also quite a ways behind. I was surprised because the 7D Mark II showed a substantial improvement in image quality at higher ISOs, but at the base ISO, the 70D actually works at a lower base ISO. They both measure at ISO 100, but as we'll see in a bit, the ISOs that the camera says it's working at isn't always the ISO that it's really working at. They usually lie. And so the 72 simply isn't using as low of an ISO, even though they're both labeled ISO 100. It doesn't happen to be the same. Looking at our most extreme example, we see distinct graininess over here in the shadow areas that isn't present in the D810, But if the GH4 looks good to you, then apparently you don't need the perfect optimal image quality. Most people don't go in and clean up images at ISO 100 or below. But if you're like me and you're a perfectionist and you just need it, or if you're making just massive prints, then you might consider optimal image quality. Now let's dig in a little bit deeper into the differences between the top three cameras here, the D810, the A7R, and the A7S. Now, of course, there are lots of differences besides just the sensors. The A7 cameras are substantially smaller than the D810. They also have a more significantly reduced lens lineup. The Nikon lens lineup is spectacular. You can use those lenses with the Sony cameras with an adapter, but autofocus isn't as great, and well, it can just be kind of a pain and overcomes a lot of the size benefits. But talking just about the image quality, we'll see that both the Sonys have about 30% less, 30% more noise in them than the D810 does in optimal conditions. And the reason is the base ISO there. You can see the D810 reports a base ISO of 64, while these two report a base ISO of 100. But the measured ISO of the D810 by DxOMark is 47. So it says it's working with ISO 64. It's really working more like with ISO 50. Why do manufacturers do this? Well, there is a little wiggle room in the ISO standards, so it's not that precise, and they could probably get away with it and still comply with the standards. But consistently, every single manufacturer underrates their own ISO in the same direction. They all basically call it a higher number than it really is, and I think it's because we tend to compare ISO 100 with ISO 100, ISO 800 with ISO 800. So if you're actually shooting at ISO, let's say 640, and you're calling it ISO 800, well, at ISO 640, you're going to be gathering much more light, and thus you're going to be able to produce cleaner images. So manufacturers are kind of gaming the system to make their images at a given ISO look better than other manufacturers, and they've all gotten into the cycle where they're all doing it. They're all lying about the ISOs a little bit. It doesn't really impact anything photographically, but it is something to kind of be aware of. Fortunately, DxOMark and their amazing measurement system takes this into account and factors it out completely so it doesn't change anything. Here's a sample image taken on the D810 at its base ISO against the A7S, the other low-light winner, at its own base ISO of ISO 100. They're both full-frame cameras, so the D810 is actually going to be gathering more light. And as you can see, if you look in the shadow details here, this should be nice, smooth texture as it is over here, but we see definite chunks of color and general graininess, and that's just a sign of not getting quite as much light. Both for a commercial client would still require a little bit of cleaning up, but the D810 would be a little bit easier. The A7R beat the A7S surprisingly because the A7R's ISO score from DxOMark, which measures high ISO performance, is substantially worse than the A7S, which beats everything in the world. The A7S here, my little boy there, has an ISO score of 3,700, almost a third of a stop better than the D810 or the A7R, which is significant. That's a massive leap in sensor technology. It produces very clean images at high ISOs, but the real base ISO here is only 80, and both the A7R and D810 go lower than that. So they gather more light, even though the sensor technology itself is inferior. And in that way, they're able to beat it and be a better studio, landscape, portrait camera, at least as far as image quality goes. So what do you do if your camera doesn't have the optimal image quality that you want? There are a couple of things you can do besides upgrading your camera. There are photographic techniques called median blending, where you take a whole bunch of pictures of the same subject and then just blend them together and kind of pick the middle value for any given pixel. Image averaging is a very similar technique, and stay tuned, subscribe to this channel, and I'll show you how to do that in the upcoming weeks. Basically, you'll be able to use your old Canon 5D Mark III and get images as clean or cleaner than the D810, assuming it's a still life subject and you have a little bit of time to put into it. How do you check your own scores? I'll show you how to do it. So let's open up a browser and head on over to Google first. What I do to look up my camera scores are to just Google DxOMark and then the name of the camera, like D810. And usually the top result is going to be the one. You can search DxOMark, but I actually find their search engine not especially reliable, so I prefer to use Google. And of course, skip their ad. And so now this will tell you the ISO score here, which is a measurement of their high ISO, but does not measure the optimal image quality. So what you want to check is to click the Measurements tab, and then click the second link here, SNR 18%. And now the optimal image quality is going to be assessed by looking at this leftmost dot, 46.3 decibels here. Now, this is useful information, but it's not in a form that the human brain can easily comprehend, right? Let's take a look at a different camera. Let's look at the EM10. And you can see that its signal to noise ratio at the base ISO is 39 decibels. Compare that to the 46.3 decibels of the D810, and how do you know which is better? Well, higher numbers are better, but let's take those two numbers, 46.3 and 39, and we'll have to subtract them. So I'm just going to open up calculator here. And we see the difference is 7.3. Decibels double for every 3 increments in value. So I'll divide that by 3. This tells us that the D810's images are 2.43 stops cleaner than the EM10 images. But as I mentioned earlier, it's also kind of hard to imagine stops because that's a logarithmic measurement. So to convert that into a value that's more easy for us to understand, so I'll switch this into scientific view and then take 2 to this exponent. So 2.432 to the power of 2.43. And we see that the D810 has images that are 5.39 times cleaner than the EM10, which is substantial, right? That's quite a bit better, mostly because of the different sensor size. But that's how the process you would go through if you wanted to compare your own camera against any other camera. Jump back into the slideshow. Here are those formulas if you wanted to perform that test yourself. What do you do with this information now? Well, first, I'd like to ask camera makers to give us lower ISOs. Nikon giving us ISO 64 on the D810 is something not many people really celebrated, but I'm excited about it because it really does make cleaner images for me in studio and landscape work, and it will save me time and let me spend more time taking pictures. So it makes it worth spending the extra money on the D810 for me, and it will for many other photographers too. There's no reason that Micro Four Thirds cameras can't support lower ISOs. Too many people are comparing ISOs directly 100 to 100 on every camera, but with smaller sensors especially, we need the ability to go to lower and lower ISOs so we can gather an equivalent amount of light and give us an equivalent amount of noise in our images. I also want to ask DxOMark to surface this information. The information is very valuable about optimal image quality, and it matters to a lot of us. But you saw the process I had to go through to find it and to turn it into a number that was easy for somebody to consume. I would get rid of that color depth value that you have on the front page. Nobody ever asks about color depth, but optimal image quality is something a lot of us care about. And if you put it on the front page, people will pay more attention to it, and pretty soon camera manufacturers will start to realize that it's important for their marketing, and they'll build it into future generations of the technology. If you found this interesting, you'll probably like my book, my photography buying guide, which has a ton of detail about cameras and lenses with a lot of specific recommendations. I also cover flashes and studio lighting, how to build a computer for image editing, just about anything you could possibly imagine about camera gear. If you're interested in post-processing, there's my book, Lightroom 5, which has over 12 hours of videos and 150 plus presets. The ebook is only $9.99 for either one of these. Check them out at sdp.io/store, and you can also get Stunning Digital Photography, the #1 photography book in the world. Thanks so much, and be sure to subscribe for more free videos and click like, and do share with your friends so that other people are aware of the importance of this fairly untalked about image measurement. Thanks.